I'm Monica Macansantos, author of Love and Other Rituals. So I see my characters as intrinsic parts of their story's locations. So they live their lives in these locations, and their attitudes and worldviews are molded by the places in which they live and the people they meet and live with. So the way my characters respond to challenges or difficulties is also informed by their milieu. For me to gain insight into a particular place, I explore the lives of those who belong to these places and their complicated and oftentimes interesting relationships with these places. Living in different countries gave me the chance to see the world in different ways and to be altered by their cultures, their landscapes, and sometimes their attitudes. They also gave me the chance to meet people whose lives were shaped by these places and to draw inspiration from their stories for my fiction. I don't intentionally set out to address big universal themes when I begin working on a new project, and I believe that as writers, we're always thinking about what it means to be human when we write. These questions begin when we overhear a story or observe a friend or neighbor responding to a difficult situation. We begin with specific instances that lead us to bigger truths in our art. But my experience is that before you arrive at that bigger truth, you're practically flying blind. So I love this question because I think that period between childhood and young adulthood is a particularly fraught period in all of our lives, since this is when we make the most difficult decisions that determine the course of our life. And how do we attain maturity, for instance, while keeping our eyes open to the difficult truths that our youth and innocence allow us to see? How do we acknowledge and deal with the moral compromises that people around us make without being ourselves morally compromised? This period in our lives is when we choose who we want to become, which means we have to learn how to navigate some choppy waters. And I think this is, well, very rich material for my fiction. Of course, like, there are unique aspects to all cultures, but these often defy explanation and must be experienced and felt, which is why I believe that books are important in depicting these unique aspects of certain diasporic cultures, such as my own, that can't just be explained or reduced to sound bites. So I disagree with the idea that portraying a character's unique culture and beliefs makes them any less universal or representative of the human condition. Because when a white author depicts characters and situations that are very specific to white culture, it's automatically assumed that their stories are universal in theme. But when it's a writer of color depicting their culture, their stories are deemed too specific to a particular culture and place to touch on universal concerns. And I, as a writer, believe that dealing with the specifics of a character's situations allows us to access universal themes. And this applies to Filipino characters, English characters, Maori characters, etc. So We all have complicated relationships with the places we call home. And since these are places that made us who we are, we continue to feel emotionally connected to them, even though they may not always be welcoming places or places where we still have friends or family. They may not even look like the places we called home growing up. I've always felt that home may not be a specific place, especially since places change, but rather a feeling that remains much more constant. So, growing up in Delaware as a brown skinned child who never truly belonged, and then returning to the Philippines at the age of 8 and taking some time to reassimilate before returning to Texas or moving to Texas and New Zealand for graduate school and feeling like an outsider in both places has perhaps allowed me to feel more sympathetic for outsiders and misfits. But to be honest, I think that all of us can feel misunderstood and dismissed by the people around us, no matter how ostensibly, at least, well adjusted we are. I believe that external observations, and these can be actions that may seem irrational from an outsider's point of view, can force us to look into people's interior lives. I feel that fiction can lead us beneath the surface to understand what's going on in someone else's interior life, which allows us to build empathy and understanding for the people whose actions confuse or even offend us. I don't think that writers ever have anything plotted out in advance. We write to answer questions that nag us, and trying to find out the answers entails oftentimes getting lost and making a lot of wrong turns that lead us to the right turns. When I was in second grade, I read E.B. White's Charlotte's Web, and it hit me particularly hard since it was my first encounter with death and grief. And we oftentimes feel that children are incapable of comprehending difficult truths such as death, but Charlotte's Web doesn't underestimate its young readers' capacity for wrestling with these truths. And what I loved about that book was that it wasn't talking down to me. Unlike some children's books, it considered me as like an equal in this conversation about death. So it taught me at an early age to embrace the losses I experienced, such as the death of a pet or sometimes even a loved one, instead of pushing the pain away, and to acknowledge my grief in ways that honored my feelings of sadness. And death is a fundamental part of life, but society teaches us to push it away and to consider it as separate from our existence. And Charlotte's Web taught me the opposite, that by accepting death as part of our lives, we honor the lives of those we have lost. And I think that that awareness of death and that acceptance of loss is what makes art and writing um, great. Uh, Later on, growing up, I was drawn to Henry James, particularly his scary novels, The Turn of the Screw. I just loved how he got into your head in like a really insidious way and like messed with your head. And I also loved how he created this atmosphere of ominousness, which is like so hard to do as a writer. And in high school, I was drawn to E.M. Forster because of his examinations of class in every gesture and detail, especially as a Filipino growing up in a very stratified society. It made me more interested in class as a writer, and in that sense, it was instrumental to my growth as a writer. In college, I was drawn to the Filipino short story writer Gregorio Brillantes because, as a Filipino whose second language was likely English, he took risks with the English language in ways that opened my eyes to like the things you could do with language, like Joseph Conrad too. Like Karima Polotan, another Filipino writer, does like similar experiments, but like Gregorio Brillantes was like particularly adventurousness with his wordplay and just like using the English language to suit his purposes. So I've recently completed a collection of essays centered around my father's sudden passing, which is tentatively entitled Returning to My Father's Kitchen. Um, New Zealand figures quite prominently in that essay collection, which is something I'm quite proud of. Most of the essays in that collection have been published in literary journals such as Colorado Review, the Hopkins Review, Lunch Ticket, and in Aotearoa, the Pantograph Punch. Two essays from the collection have been named notable in the Best American Essays, which I'm also quite proud of. I've also finished a novel about the Marcos years in the Philippines, a draft of which served as my PhD thesis at the IIML in Victoria. Right now, I'm working on a new novel and a new collection of stories. So thank you, Wellington City Library, for having me.